Welcome to the first class of our 6-week online course, New England Research. My name is Jennifer Morse. I'm the Director of Education and Online Programs here at American Ancestors and New England Historic Genealogical Society. I will be moderating this class and each class over the next 6 weeks. As we all know, New England is an area rich with published family history resources, record keeping since the 17th century, and a plethora of supplemental records. Still, each state presents unique challenges, gaps in records, and other obstacles. Each week, you'll hear from a different NEHGS expert on a specific New England state. We'll discuss go-to records, resources, repositories, and research techniques. And tonight, we begin with a look at Massachusetts. So your instructor for this session is Chief Genealogist David Allen Lambert. David has been on the staff of NEHGS since 1993 and is the organization's Chief Genealogist. He is an internationally recognized speaker on the topics of genealogy and history. He's published many articles in the New England Historical and Genealogical Register, the New Hampshire Genealogical Record, Rhode Island Roots, the Mayflower Descendant, and American Ancestors magazine. He's also the author of A Guide to Massachusetts Cemeteries and is the tribal genealogist for the Massachusetts Ponkapog Indians of Massachusetts. His genealogical expertise includes New England and Atlantic Canadian records of the 17th through 21st century, military records, DNA research, and Native American and African American genealogical research in New England. So David will begin by presenting a brief overview of the history and settlement of Massachusetts, followed by some go-to published guides. Much of the class will be focused on what records exist for the state, how to find them, and how to make the most of these resources in your family history research. You'll find a PDF of today's slides at the online course page, as well as a handout. And starting tomorrow, you'll be able to watch a recording of this presentation on that course page. And before moving on, I do want to note that we are, of course, broadcasting from our homes to your home with various limitations and distractions. We apologize in advance if there are any interruptions from our end, dogs barking, children crying, hopefully no children crying. And we thank you for your patience. If we do lose the connection for any reason, you'll still have access to a full recording of this class on that webpage. And again, just make sure that you remain muted throughout the presentation. You will be able to ask questions by typing them into the chat panel, and David will answer as many as he can during 3 Q&A sessions. I know many of you have already found that chat panel. You might either see a little comic strip kind of icon or just the word chat with a plus symbol next to it. If you click on that plus sign or click on that comic strip icon, the chat panel should open and you can type your question in there. All right, so without further ado, I will turn things over to David.
Hi, Jennifer, and hello to everyone else out there. From my home to yours, I see a lot of familiar names in the room there. All those of you who have joined us today, many people are longtime NEHGS friends and family, and I'm delighted to talk to you about my home state. Massachusetts, or the officially known as the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, has other nicknames, the Bay State, the Pilgrim State, the Puritan State, the Old Colony State, and the one you may not know about, the Baked Bean State. Yes, my family's lived in Massachusetts since 1629 when my first ancestor, Richard Ingersoll, came to Salem, Massachusetts as part of the Winthrop fleet, and his 8th great-granddaughter, my mother, who was born in Canada, arrived in 1930. So we went full circle. We were in Massachusetts, left Massachusetts, came back to Massachusetts, and I have a plethora of ancestors, and chances are if you have Massachusetts roots, we're probably cousins somewhere down the line. All right, so let's move forward with a little bit of history about Massachusetts. Massachusetts, as you well know, of course, is where the Pilgrims settled in 1620 and the Mass Bay Colony, but it had a history of the first peoples of Massachusetts, the Native American population. In fact, the state of Massachusetts itself gets its name from Massachusetts, the local Indian tribe that was situated in the Boston area. I can show you on the map here. So these were where the Massachusetts Indians were. Their seat was here at Massachusetts Hummock, which was where Chickatawbit, who knew John Winthrop, was. And it basically means Massachusetts, people of the Great Hill. In Milton and Canton lies the Great Blue Hills. If you go to the Rocky Mountains, you could probably miss it in size comparison, but our humble state was named for this, of the people who resided by this hill. Of course, there are other Native Americans. Of course, you have heard of the Pilgrims' interaction with the Wampanoag, the people of the First Light. You have the Nauset Indians of Cape Cod. You have the Nipmuc of Western Mass, and the Pocumtuck out towards Deerfield. If you had anybody in the Deerfield raid, that was the range of the Indians there. But that is going to be sort of just touching base. If you have Indians up in northern New Hampshire, the Pennacook Indians, you have in Maine, you have the Penobscot Indians. But this is pretty much the settlement of the Native American population. And the book that I show here is a book that I was honored to write the preface for by Jeremy Bangs, who is a well-known pilgrim historian out in Amsterdam. And he wrote all of these early deeds that were done by the Native American population with both the Massachusetts and the Wampanoag Indians. Massachusetts, because of it being one of the first settled areas in New England, is really probably the most center of the colony for the New England colonies. In fact, is always maintained as being the largest and most influential of all the New England colonies. Hence, obviously, with Boston being in the heat of tensions in the Revolutionary War, Lexington and Concord, you have the maritime history of Cape Cod, of Boston, of the North Shore. You have the great influence of the factories on the major rivers, the Merrimack, or on the Connecticut River. And so you have a great history of the Commonwealth. And of course, this could almost be spilled into a 6-part course just on Massachusetts alone, but we're going to kind of give you a capsulized version of it. One of the major things that occurred, of course, Plymouth Colony, settled by the Pilgrims in 1620, would be met by the settlement of the Mass Bay Colony in 1629 in Salem, and then later into Boston and Charlestown. These were 2 separate colonies, and the merger did not occur until 1691. So think of it as 2 separate colonies, even though geographically connected. They were separate in ideology and in governments and record keeping, etc. The major split of a land portion of Massachusetts came when the District of Maine separated. During the Missouri Compromise of 1820, Missouri became a slave state, Maine became a free state from Massachusetts, and this occurred 200 years ago in 1820. Major location point of migration, that's definitely Massachusetts. People either stuck around Massachusetts for generations, like my family did, or were here for a generation or 2 and went to places like Connecticut, Rhode Island, Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, and then went points even further away, New York, Ohio, or may even heard the call of the gold rush and went all the way out to California. So jumping off point, Massachusetts being a port state would definitely be that. This is one of the earliest maps of Massachusetts, and you kind of have to turn your head to a 45-degree angle to kind of see it, but that little part at the bottom left is actually Cape Cod. So you've got Cape Cod down here, and you have Martha's Vineyard in Nantucket. But this basically shows the earliest settlements, and it's a little out of focus. This was one of the best copies I could get to it, but you can see the different waterways. Now, this is down in Rhode Island here, but you have the Merrimack River here. You have the Connecticut River, and this is in 1677. At the closure of the King Philip's War, the people that were settled just around the coast of Massachusetts, the earliest towns being nearby to ports or not far away by a riverway, would then go further into the western part of the state. Some colonies, such as New Hampshire and Maine, would also see similar settlement patterns as you would for a colonial settlement. You don't want to go too far into the outreaches of the colony because you just don't know what you're going to meet with the native Indians. At that point in time, there really was not surety of being sure of a fort. Garrison houses were very common where you would meet in case of hostilities. And you have to remember at that point in time, we are still not in good relations with Quebec and French military, and the English military would come in arms both in Europe, but also in New England. All right, let's move on to the next slide. So just to kind of a touch base on a timeline, if we will. So we discussed the Great Migration a little bit. The Great Migration is that period in time between 1620 and 1640 when the largest influx of settlement comes into Massachusetts as well as the rest of New England. This is the time frame that Robert Charles Anderson, started writing about in 1988 and wrote The Great Migration Begins. Now that covered the first years from 1620 to 1633. Then he did 1634 to 35 with the Great Migration series continuing. And then he did, of course, all the study books, the Winthrop Fleet, Puritan Pedigrees, and all of the wonderful stories that he has put together, including most recently the Great Migration Directory, that have been a wonderful way of learning about these early families. Now, of course, you're going to have an influx in the 17th century, well into the early part of the 18th century by English and Scottish and Irish, but the largest next group of settlers would be coming in as the arrival of the Ulster Scots. And the Scotch-Irish, if you will, were coming in around 1718 or so, sometimes a little bit earlier, a little bit before, but you see them into the settlement of the towns around Massachusetts, whereas the old New England family names are now replaced with names like McKendry and McCory. These are names that you would not normally see in the 1600s. The French and Indian War hampers efforts for interior settlement until after that conflict. So you do see settlement around the Connecticut River Valley, but way out into the Berkshires of Massachusetts, you're really not seeing that settlement going on well until after the French and Indian Wars stopped. As I had said previously, the interaction with the French was not exactly a friendly climate. Now, many people in Massachusetts left on their own free will, or peoples like Roger Williams and Anne Hutchinson, because of their religious views, were not seen welcome to the Mass Bay Colony, and they left for Rhode Island. Connecticut would be settled in 1636. New Englanders also sought areas such as Long Island, New York. For both political and religious reasons, people left. And in fact, New York settlement by New Englanders occurred after the expulsion of the Dutch as a ruling political system there in the 1660s. Now, migrants also leave to settle northern New England, and if you thought western Massachusetts was a bit of the wilderness, the mountains in the hill regions of Vermont and New Hampshire really were a challenge. First off, you're having areas that had not been settled. You're carving right out of the wilderness. So essentially thinking of the 18th century as the wilderness that the Pilgrims and the Mass Bay colonists were getting in the 1620s, 1630s. That's sort of that same element. But in the idea of primogeniture, where the oldest son inherits, these families had 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 kids. You're not going to inherit the family farm, so you need to settle out and move forward into your own domain. And that adventurous spirit for leaving New England, especially Massachusetts, took place from the 1600s and continues still to this day. So the settlement, 1775 to 1783, there was a divide. Of course, the people that were supporting the king, or later known as the Loyalists, or those loyal to the King of England, were not seen as welcome after the end of the war. Many times the Tories, the Loyalists, their houses were burned, their properties were seized, and many of them fled for New York, and then ultimately they fled to places like Nova Scotia and New Brunswick in Atlantic Canada. So you find them. In fact, many loyalists, I have loyalists in my family tree from New York, would go up to Nova Scotia, and then their descendants would work back into New England, not even a generation or two later. The Industrial Revolution, as I had mentioned, factories. Massachusetts is dotted with shoe factories of any sort of boot factory that you might have seen in the 19th and 20th century. all sorts of goods were produced here. And unfortunately, the factories of the latter part of the 20th century saw the movement into production outside of the United States. So a lot of these factories that were where your ancestors worked are now loft condominiums or malls. So they've taken a lot of the old buildings and preserved them. If you go up to Lowell, there are wonderful old mill buildings there, as well as New Bedford, and you would probably get a real thrill out of seeing how your ancestors lived. My own family left New Hampshire and came down to work in the mills of Lowell in the 1840s. During that same time frame, you saw another population shift, and this is the famine Irish during the potato famine of the 1840s, and you're seeing an influx of Irish coming into Massachusetts, especially into Boston. The Irish would originally settle in places like the North End, and it was the place, in fact, where the colonial Bostonians had once lived. They're living in the old houses. The areas are not in the best of shape, and it is not the most desirable area. The upper class of Boston had moved into Beacon Hill, into places like Roxbury and Dorchester, and downtown Boston had a population of Irish, and Roman Catholics were now removing from the once Protestant city of Boston, and even the political process would change. You would find names like Fitzgerald and Kennedy and Sullivan are coming into the political arena, and these descendants of the famine Irish have now changed the history of Boston and Massachusetts and became part of the interior strength of the working class and political class of the Commonwealth. Now, by 1865, you're seeing immigration of ethnic groups, especially French Canadians, Italians. By the 1880s and 90s, you're seeing Jewish populations due to the pogroms going over in Russia. You're seeing all the people fleeing in the early part of the 20th century from different war-torn parts of Europe and coming to Massachusetts. And by the time of World War I, a typical small town in Massachusetts that in the 18th century would have just had First Parish Church descendants of Puritans or Pilgrims would have a variety of people living in all sorts of neighborhoods. Schools would be mixed with people that were from Poland, from Italy. Their grandparents may have came from Ireland. And it truly became the great American mixing pot. In Massachusetts, the Bay State would welcome all of them. Now, there's some general guides that I want to talk about with research itself, and I hope that some of these are on your bookshelf. Now, a new edition of this, the 6th edition, will be out sometime soon. Rhonda McClure is editing it, and this is the Genealogist Handbook for New England Research. Why this is a really valuable tool is because it gives you all of the towns in the Commonwealth as well as all of New England with the dates they were incorporated. It's so very important to know, say, a particular town like Stoughton was incorporated in 1726. And to know that the county of Norfolk, which it's located, started in 1793. Now, there's almost 70 odd years of why would I not find probates and deeds for Stoughton? That county doesn't exist. To know that Norfolk County was part of Suffolk County. To also know what towns were created from another community is very important, because if you're looking for cemeteries, for instance, to know that the original town of Stoughton, for instance, incorporates what is now Canton, Sharon, and Avon, means that maybe that older cemetery or family cemetery may now be in a new incorporated town, even though in the old vital records it says it's in the town of Stoughton. There are detailed maps. All the courthouses and their addresses and contact information and hours of operation are listed. You also, all the variety of different libraries and archives throughout New England are in it. And again, the 6th edition is coming. I know it is being worked on as we speak. Now, not to beat my own drum, but there is another Massachusetts guide, this one not being produced by the New England Historic Genealogical Society. I was commissioned by the National Genealogical Society to create part of their state series the book for Massachusetts. And this has a bibliography of resources for a variety of topics, many of which I used to create this lecture for you. And it has all the websites and the databases and all the primary resources. This book's a little over 40 pages long and will give you an in-depth look into the resources from Massachusetts. So if you don't happen to have that book, I hope that you might consider it for during the 400th anniversary of the settlement of Massachusetts. Another book that was created, unfortunately it's out of print now, is Historical Data Relating to Counties, Cities, and Towns in Massachusetts. Now this is an in-depth book, and it started back in the 1960s under Secretary of State of Massachusetts to put in all the town names, the incorporation dates, the dates when land was annexed and what the parent towns. It also gives you the neighborhood names. Like in my hometown, there's a section known as Dry Pond. Well, it's not an incorporated town, but it's a neighborhood. We may have even had a post office in North Stoughton, and in that community, there is no settlement as a particular town, but it's just a neighborhood. So this will lay all those out, which is very useful when you're looking at old deeds. And the other thing is there are places like the Quabbin Reservoir where you have drowned towns. So we have towns like Enfield, Massachusetts, which is now extinct. And you may have old names for towns like Plantation 2, which now has a brand new name, that are part of the history of the Commonwealth. In this well-indexed book, done in 1997 was the last edition, is very valuable. I hope that it is reprinted again. Another great book, and this is available, as are the first two books, My NGS Guide as well as the New England Handbook, is this A Guide to Massachusetts Public Records written by Carol D. Wright. Now, don't let the date fool you. It is a record list available as of 1884, but it's invaluable. The reason, because it will tell you what existed in town records, both the vital records recorded, the individual town records of the town records of the meetings and the tax records, as well as the church records that survived as of 1884. Now, when we reprinted this in 2014, there's a foreword by David Dearborn, but we didn't amend the book, but it's still useful. So if all of a sudden in 2020 you're looking for vital records in a town, you can't find them, or you're looking for church records in another, you look at this book and you can find out that they didn't exist even in 1884. You can rest assured that you're not missing something, that the records have been gone for more than a century. Another valuable book, and this one we don't sell, but it's a good resource, especially with New England court records. It goes one step above what we have in our New England Handbook. This is for all the different courts in New England, and this is a research guide by Diane Rappaport. This lists, of course, the Massachusetts courts and the history of all the court systems in New England. But the nice thing about it is it also lists everything that is an Family History Library microfilm. And as you know, the Family History Library in Salt Lake City has been working diligently to take all of these microfilm that they once had available just on film and to make them digitized. And court records are no exception. Now, there are some that are locked down and you need to be at an affiliate library or in Salt Lake City. Of course, right now during COVID, it's a little hard to look at these affiliate images, but more and more are being placed online. These are a great resource because court records in New England are such a valuable tool, may it be from divorce records or just the small claims between an individual farmer suing another one. These small courts are going to be a valuable resource to your research, and they're usually very underutilized. Most of them have not been completely transcribed. In fact, even the calendar indexes of court records in New England have not even been touched upon to be indexed out. So take a peek for this book. I probably can find a copy online for sale, I'm sure, on Amazon. Now, one book that I must say is the one-stop shopping volume. If I had to run out of my house with only 5 books for genealogy, I would grab this one. Now, the Great Migration Directory, Immigrants to New England, 1620 to 1640 by Robert Charles Anderson is really the opus of great resources for 20 years of the earliest part of Massachusetts as well as New England. Now, it's going to tell you, for one thing, everyone who has arrived by 1640, and this is Bob's exhaustive research, that if someone had been here in the Commonwealth or in New England, he will point that person out in the research. If there is no hard evidence, there will be no entry. So it's almost like Bob's call on the matter. Now, I would say that there's always room for error in any genealogical. I like to attribute genealogy as sort of wet cement. So there's always a possibility you could find something that could include somebody in it. But I can tell you, since this book came out, I have not heard of one case yet. It does tell you the place of origin of the immigrant. So if they know right down to where he was married, or where he was baptized, or where he's known to come from a primary reliable source, then it will be included. If the arrival date is known, they will include that, or it's estimated. For instance, if you arrived in Massachusetts and you bought land in 1642, and that's the first entry, you're not going to be in the book. If you have a child baptized in 1637, that's your first entry, you'll be included. It just takes one entry that occurred by 1640 to put you into this volume. And it also lists the best bibliographical sources in print. I mean, in some cases, it may be something that was done very thoroughly in the 19th century, but Bob has painstakingly gone through journals, published genealogies of the reliable sort, as well as original records to put this volume together. And if you have early New England ancestors, specifically Massachusetts, I think you'll find this an invaluable book on your bookshelf. All right, let's start with vital records, and we'll take a look at what's available. We'll talk from the earliest to the more current. So Massachusetts, we're very lucky, in my humble opinion, that we have the most complete set in the nation. There are not a lot of fires. There's a lot of good record keeping. Massachusetts, bar none, was being required to keep vital records from the earliest time. You find them in the 1620s, as well as almost the colony's mandated requirement to put them down in the 1640s. So the variety of town clerk record keeping, as a genealogist, I'm sure you can see a variety of handwriting, a variety of consistency. It's no different from Massachusetts. You can have a very detail-oriented town clerk. You can have one that did very sloppy record keeping. You can have one that just has a bad sense of recording genealogical data. Like, you know, I always thought it made sense to have a birth of a child listed with only the father. As you can sure, ladies, that there takes two for the process of this, but the mother's not included. This is very typical in the early 17th century records. You may just find the father's name and not the mother. These records, of course, are going to be complemented by looking at church records that you hope that maybe both parties are listed. The vital records to 1850 were published in over 200 towns, and for the majority of eastern Massachusetts, there are published books, and we'll talk a little bit about them. For other towns out in western Mass, you can look at the Corbin collection, the Roland H. Cook collection, the Holbrook microfiche, which incidentally is on Ancestry.com as part of the Massachusetts town records, but you can also look at those same town vital records on Family Search. Now, there are also manuscripts, NEHGS with over 250,000 manuscripts. We have so many things that you can look at, and it is such a tremendous asset on vital records just in our own manuscript collection. We have over 28 million manuscripts, but the amount that we have typescripts and vital records is just phenomenal. These were actually used in the basis of creating these pre-1850 vital records, and NEHGS was one of the many individual organizations that put them together. Now, the TAN books, if you will, are these books that if you've been to NEHGS or any library, you've probably seen these series. They were done by the Systematic History Fund series. There was money set aside by the Commonwealth to go forward and to transcribe and get the vital records prior to 1850. Now, the state mandated in 1841 that birth, marriages, and deaths were recorded, but they didn't stop this with 1841 because some of the towns, including Boston, really didn't get their act together recording vital records and sending them into the state to 1850. So this is a good complement. So you may find some of the later 1840 vital records also in the statewide records when we talk about them. Now, these include births, deaths. They're arranged alphabetically. Now, there were some books that were done outside of the series in the 1890s or the early 1900s, which were done for places like Dedham and Stoughton and Rehoboth, where they were done almost in the order of the pages, not alphabetically in order. So verbatim, if you will, from the original vital records, and they were indexed at the end. These other tan books, when you get birth, marriages, and deaths alphabetically in order, they're very valuable. Now, the one thing I do want to point out is that you will find also African-American families in this. Now, unfortunately, they're segregated at the end of each one of the chapters, which is unfortunately the style of the day. I did a book for Stoughton myself for the Mayflower Society a number of years ago and redid it, and everything is included from page 1 to page 400, for instance, and everything is in order as they are, and nothing is segregated out as it should be. I find that vital records should be done as they were written and not interpreted. Now, so in case of Massachusetts pre-1850 vital records, you're going to get marriage intentions and you're going to get marriage records. Now, maybe the intentions recorded in another town and you've got the marriage in another community as well, or they're in the same one. You want to try to look at both records. In the case of the pre-1850 vital records, if it has the marriage date, they often put an asterisk and said intention also recorded, but they don't give you the date. As a genealogist, I want both those dates. Now, many of these vital records also came from church records, cemetery records, Bible records, or even private records. So if your ancestor kept a very detailed journal and wrote down all the deaths that occurred in, say, Sandwich, Massachusetts, they may be included in the collection. The other thing is that you can also find most of these volumes on AmericanAncestors.org. So you can go onto our website as well as go onto our bookshelves. So hopefully you've utilized these books in your research. Now, the next thing that you're going to find here are the actual pages from within it. So just to give you an example, you're going to find sometimes surnames are going to be combined. So like you have Dean here under 2 variations of it. You're also going to notice that there were abbreviations like GR3. Now that is here, and there's GR2. If you look in the abbreviations at the beginning, you'll find out that those abbreviations either stand for church records, those are CRs, or GRs are going to be gravestone records, and you're getting all of these abbreviations explained to what the primary sources that they used. Now, there are the non-standard varieties of the vital records. They were done in the 19th century, but they were also done into the later part of the 20th century by places like the Society of Mayflower Descendants in the state of Rhode Island, who did the vital records for Yarmouth, Massachusetts. And as I said, done with original pagination. So here you have page 73 and the records with the tabulation just as it appears on the page. And these are 18th century records right here, just as you would see them with the correct verbiage. Now, statewide Massachusetts vital records started in 1841, and we're very lucky because we are the earliest state in the union to actually require statewide vital records. And these start early on just recording deaths. Births and marriages were sometimes recorded as statistics in the actual town reports, and some of them are reporting from the town clerk to the state. So there are 2 copies. You have the town copy that you can look at, and those you can find on Family Search or on the Holbrook Microfiche. That's on Ancestry, on the Mass Town Records, or you can look at the state copy. Now, I would say look at both. Now, keeping that in mind, the town clerk had to write it down first. At the end of the year, starting in 41, they made a return of all the records and sent it to the Secretary of State's office. So it's a checks and balances. So if the town hall burned down, you would have the state copy. In the case of my hometown, there was a fire in the 1840s and we lost some of the early town vital records from the 1840s, but luckily they're included in the statewide returns, so we have a backup from the state. Now, American Ancestors has the availability that you can search on an ancestor. So I'm just going to put in one of my own near and dear relatives, Alexander Poor, which is the name of my great-great-grandfather and my great-grandfather. And I'm just going to pretend to do a search. Now, I'm not putting in anything more than just the first name and the last name. You can put in other things like years and record type to narrow it down. I go in here and I look through the records and I find this marriage in 1874. All I have to do is click on the hyperlinked name with the camera icon and it will allow me to view the image. It's telling me that it's from volume 264, page 57. It was recorded in Boston, and I hit view right down here. And the actual record will come up on the screen. And here is the marriage of my great-grandparents who were married at a double wedding ceremony in 1874 by the same minister. And this is my great-grandmother's sister and my great-grandmother. So this record I can easily download. I can zoom in on the record. I can even save it right to my computer, or I can just print it off. Whatever you care to do, but this is a quick way to search Massachusetts vital records. And this first range is 1841 to 1910. Now we have others as well. A separate database that we have in the Massachusetts vital records and American Ancestors are the vital records 1911 to 1915 and 1916 to 1920. Now, something that started in the early 20th century where vital records went from being on a ledger sheet with 40 names on it to, like for death records, for instance, to actually have an individual certificate. So let's do a search for that. Now, one of the things you can do as a town historian is I want to look at everybody who died in my town between 1911 and 1915 in Stoughton. Note, I didn't put a name on here. You can also put in volume and page if you wish, if you already have a citation. But I'm just going to do my search by a year range and a town, and that I'm looking for death records. When I do my search, I get a variety of matches back, and it's basically giving me all of the records from 1911, and then it will give me 1912, and they're done into the chronological order of them being recorded. So I'm going to click on one of them here and show you the type of record I mean. So we go from having a ledger to actually having a certificate. And here we have the death record of William McKee, who died February 14th, 1911. You get the name of the cemetery, and you get his parents and where he was born. One thing that's a little different in the early death records in Massachusetts, just a note to let you know, they did not require where the person was buried. So from 1841 on till about the 1890s, you're only going to get the cause of death, place of that the parents were from occasionally. They'll give you parents where they are from. It will get you the parents' names. You're going to find a variety of things on here, but what you're not going to find is where they're buried. So that's when you have to turn to the town record. These later records, when they went into certificate format, these standard certificates included in the actual cemetery name. You will find in the 1890s, it will ask you place of death, place of residence, and place of burial, but in some cases it just says the town they're buried in. If it's someplace like Boston, you really need to turn to the local copy, and that's just a little bit of a tip to make your searching a little bit easier. Again, we do have the records to 1916 to 1920 as well on American Ancestors. We also have bound indexes, and this is due to the work of Dr. Neil Todd, who is my first boss at NEHGS. He was in charge of the former inquiry service, now known as a research service. He had an agreement to copy out the bound indexes that were falling apart at the Vital Record Office. The state registry had these indexes. They were in tatters. Neil made a copy for them and a copy for us. Incidentally, our copy's in better shape because it was not as handled as much as the ones at the registry. So we have these birth indexes, marriage indexes, and death indexes. Now, the Massachusetts vital records, currently 1841 to 1925, are at the state archives. Now, these are the original returns, the books themselves, and these are where you would look at the microfilm in the case of these records. And if they're not on microfilm yet, and when they receive them, they will pull the originals from the vault. So that is the contact information for you there. The amazing thing is I worked with the state back in 1987. It was $3 for a certified copy of a birth, marriage, or death if it was at the archives, even back then. So the price hasn't changed. Now, the records that are afterwards, now the one thing that you have to keep in mind, and I saw a question pop up there on the screen. We're going to do questions during the breaks, but since this is part of the discussion, Massachusetts has a 92-year hold on records. So for instance, right now they have 1926 to 1930. 1930 will not be considered released to the public. I mean, you can get them from the Vital Record Office, but to be sent to the archives, the record December 31st, 1930 will have to be December 31st, 92 years later, so 2022. At that point in time, the records are sent. The Family History Library will digitize them. And they're still doing the ones from the 1920s. It's a little bit of a slow going process on them currently. They haven't finished through 1925, but they do have the images to them, my knowledge. They already filmed them at the archives. The Registry of Vital Statistics is not the most accessible place, but it's cheaper than writing through the mail to get them. The cheapest way to get a Massachusetts vital record, however, my tip to you is get it from the city or town. It's a lot cheaper. The state charges almost over $20 for a record. If you go in there during their limited research hours, they're going to charge you $9 an hour just to look at the record. So hopefully you get your indexes already searched ahead of time. And on my syllabus, you'll find all the links to the online indexes so you can do that ahead of time. Now, vital records 1926 to 2020, the Department of Vital Statistics, the registry, has the birth, marriage, and death indexes there. They have both bound indexes, and in some cases, the indexes are on computer. Another thing that they have, which you have to use in-house, I so wish it was online, they have already scanned every birth record from 1953 to the present. So if you're paying your $9 an hour, you don't need to make a request for births for that time frame. You could sit at a computer terminal, and up it comes on the screen. Sorry, folks, they don't let you use your digital camera, and there's no way to save the image to a thumb drive. You still have to buy the certificate from them at the counter. Now, American Ancestors has the death index for Massachusetts from 1970 to 2003. And other things that you want to do is you want to check the Social Security death index online, and that may even give you later ones right up through 2019, say. Now, there are alternate sources for everything, and for vital records, I had mentioned Social Security. You can find out on Ancestry.com, as well as American Ancestors has a version of Social Security, death as well. There are city directories, and we'll talk a little bit about city directories. One of the key things I find on the city directories is if you died in 1921, that the 1922 city directory may say that you died. So you may get a date of death that goes after 1925 that you can get right from a city directory. Then you can just order the record. So you may not even need an index. You just may have stumbled across the record. Probate records are obviously going to tell you the person is deceased. In some cases, it may even have the exact date of death included. And in some probate files later on, there's sometimes a copy of the death record. Now, notices and obituaries in newspapers, there are things like newspapers.com or Genealogy Bank. You can use that for an alternative source for vital records, obviously, and cemetery records. Now, not every cemetery in Massachusetts has an office. It's why I wrote my guide to Massachusetts cemeteries, because places like Granary Cemetery or King's Chapel don't have an office you can walk into, and they can tell you exactly where your ancestors buried. Cemetery records, burial records, and also just using gravestones can often be a source for you to use. And the other thing, which is great, Massachusetts vital records are currently still open, unless it's an illegitimate birth or an adoption. You will find that you can look at records right down to the current day. However, town clerks until about the 1960s, sometimes the 1940s, depending on the town, recorded the births, marriages, and deaths. These books are in local libraries. You can take them off the annual report of the town and you'll find these records right there. And this is true also at the state library in Massachusetts. I hope that some of these books get digitized and put online. That will give you vital records even beyond what's currently available from the state. Now, here's an example of one of those annual town reports. Now, I said Massachusetts state law, the records at the archives are only go down to 1925. Here are vital records of births in 1948. Now, it's not as detailed as a birth record, but you could find in this case, Richard Benson, born January 5th, 1948, is the son of Charles A. and Rita Frances Lynch. So you're going to get the maiden name of the mother and the father's name as well. And these are records that are right on the shelves in the public libraries or the town halls in Massachusetts. The smaller towns kept them later. You're not going to find books like this, say, for Boston or for larger communities. It just, the too many pages would be to record all the births, marriages, deaths. But the smaller communities in Massachusetts, this is a gold mine. Now, vital record pitfalls, unfortunately, not all vital records were recorded. Keeping in fact the Massachusetts were recording them back to the 1600s. Places like Boston weren't recording births well until almost 1850. There was a lag between about 1790 and 1850 where you won't find any vital records. Case in point, my great-grandfather, Alexander Poor, was born in Boston in the same house that his parents were recorded at when they got married in 1844. Their marriage is recorded. The death of his sister in 1847 is recorded. The death of his other sister in 1844. But his birth in 1848 and his other siblings' births are not recorded. Depended on the city and town clerks. The larger the community, the harder it was to record the vital records. Now, events may have also occurred in one town, but were recorded in another. You may find in the case, my grandmother, for instance, was from Milton, Massachusetts. Her husband was from North Reading, and they were married in Dorchester. So in some cases, it's recorded in 3 places, depending on how the town clerk took the record in. And don't assume you can't find a vital record that the event may have happened in another town. And that's the thing about it. Don't just keep your blinders on one community. Knowing what the boundaries of surrounding towns will help you, and also knowing the history of the town, especially in the earlier days, to know that the town name may have changed, that it dotted off and became another community. So there's a variety of things you can do. So don't give up hope. An event may be never recorded at all. Now, and that's one of the things that you have to come to realize. You may have to look at alternate records like church records, or maybe looking at diaries. I had one ancestor that I was born in 1822. There's no birth recorded for her, but the doctor's account book for the small town that she was born in recorded that she cost $1.75, and she was recorded as her birth the night before.
All right, well, thanks, David. So let's get to your questions. Anything that you'd like to ask, go ahead and type it into the chat panel. So let's see. Paul asks, what is the status of Governor Baker's attempt to lock down recent vital records? Do you know of any news or updates with that?
Well, that was really in the news for quite a while, right before COVID. But since COVID, I haven't heard a lot about that being pushed forward. I don't think that's obviously at the top of his concerns right at the moment. I know that the genealogical community has definitely been supporting that the records are not locked down, including American Ancestors. We've sent a letter in support of keeping the record access available. I have personally not heard anything, and I'm usually on top of these things because of the Extreme Genes radio show I do, because we talked a lot about it when it first came out. But I'm always willing to hear from you. So if you hear any news, please reach out to me and let me know. But currently, I know of no changes. I don't think any action is taken forward on it currently.
And Janet asks, were illegitimate births less likely to be recorded in the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries? Is there kind of a special strategy needed to unearth some of those records?
Well, if it's an illegitimate birth in the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries, you'll find them with no problem, because they had no problem with recording them, including even in the town reports that are public If it's just a single parent listed, they'll record it. Church records will often record the baptism as well, but the mother had to come forward and confess the sin of fornication. You may also find that the father is called out in court records to pay for the support of the child. So that's not a problem. It's the 20th century. Around, I think it's the 19 teens, that single parent births or adoptions were bound in different volumes from the actual records. I think it was probably almost around World War I. My own wife's grandmother was born out of wedlock, and her birth in 1913, and she was adopted. That record I could look at when I used to go to the Vital Record Office when they had the 1913 births. It's the later ones, I think just around World War I or maybe by 1920, that they were bound separately, as well as stillbirths were also bound separately.
And Kathy asks about prison records. She found an ancestor listed as an inmate in a census, but haven't been able to follow up. Do those exist? Are they available?
Sure. In Massachusetts, prison records are available if they survive. Prior to about 1930, I think that's the last cutoff. It may have been extended. Having a grandfather who was a bootlegger, I can tell you I found every incarceration on the man. They are very entertaining records. Sometimes you get the full account. I mean, those of us with our black sheep ancestry, if you want to know the crime, how long, how tall your ancestor was, his weight, his height, complexion, where he was born. These are the type of things you can find even into the earliest records of prisons. The state prison in Charlestown, those records are currently through 1830. They go that far back, and these registers exist. We have a copy of them on microfilm at NEHGS, and they're on Family Search. So you can find them. It's really a question of the inmate. Sometimes inmate can mean you're an inmate of the poor farm as well as a prison. But if he was a prisoner, contact first the state archives and see if they have the record, or you can feel free to contact me at NEHGS, and I may be able to help you drill down and find the record group that you're looking for.
And one last question before moving on. I know we have a lot to get through, and time's just going by very quickly. But Sandy asks, so when will the Massachusetts deaths be added to Family Search for 1924 and 1925?
Do you know, I wish I could answer that question for you. I know a few years ago they were scanned. They were scanned all at the same time. They had missionaries out there filming. I don't know if there was a problem with the images themselves, because that 1923-24, in my handout, I kind of give you a breakdown of what's currently online. Those have been pretty stagnant for a while, so I'm not entirely sure. I would imagine that they probably, if they had a problem with them, they would probably been rectified and they would have gone out, because they do a pretty good quality control. But at the present moment, I am not sure when they're out. Hopefully soon.
I'm sorry, just one other question. Luann says, the Corbin collection used to be on, or was on CD years ago, but it's no longer supported by new Windows machines. Any idea if that will be put online, or is it available somewhere?
The Corbin collection at NEHGS, we have the same problem with those old CD-ROMs. They're good for coasters now more than anything else. Right at the moment, we don't have the legal right to put it online, but I would imagine that at some point those microfilms will probably be transcribed, and maybe the data from the CDs that we originally had could be put online. That is probably a good question for our web team. Which I'm making a note of it right now to actually send an email to them.
All right, so let's move on. I know we have a lot of other records to get through, so I will turn it back over to David.
Okay, we talked about marriage records will not always marital bliss lasts forever, and this is true even back to the 1700s. So let's talk a little bit about divorce records. Early divorce records from 1639 to 1692, there are known to be 40 cases that were brought to the General Court or the Court of Assistance for marital, the act of non-marital bliss for a variety of reasons, from abuse, from having affairs, whatever the case might be, or the husband just disappeared. So there are these cases that come up, and it's even in the 1600s. Now, 229 cases exist between 1692 and 1786. Now, with divorces at that point in time were held by the person went forward with a petition to the governor and the governor's council, and they are the ones that actually heard the pleas for divorce. These records are part of the judicial archives at the Mass State Archives, and these cases still exist. They're part of the Supreme Judicial Court's collection of records. Now, between 1786 and 1887, the Supreme Judicial Court, again, Mass State Archives, you have to use law dockets to locate these cases. And the problem with the SJC, they're done in calendar cases. So the best way to get into these records is their archivist, Elizabeth Bouvier. If you tell them a date that you assume somebody was divorced by, and you tell them the county, she or one of her assistants will actually search for you. You can't say 1870 to 1880. You really have to narrow it down to a year or two, and they will check the indexes for you. Now, from 1887 to 1922, instead of the Supreme Judicial Court for the entire Commonwealth, county courts or superior courts are set up. So that works until 1922. And then after 1922, your regular county probate courts handle divorces under the family courts. And these records are right in the particular counties, Norfolk County, Suffolk County, if it's 1922 to present. Now, the problem is that you have to go to these courts. Not a lot of these records are scanned or online. They have not been transcribed out. The Massachusetts Department of Vital Statistics has an index from 1952 forward, and that is again at that 150 Mount Vernon address that I gave you for the registry. So you can look at the index now. They won't have the divorce cases, but they will have the index, and it will tell you the county it falls into. Town records. Now, a lot of people look at vital records. A lot of people don't look at town records, and I think it's really one of the underutilized collections. They are probably the best thing for the 17th and 19th century. Problem is, they're not indexed. A lot of times people want to just get into collections that are indexed. There are very few town records that are published in books, but you can find them digitized online. Now, Family Search is one place that you will find town records. The Mass Town Record Series, part of the Holbrook fiche, J. Mac Holbrook, when he did this fiching in the 70s and 80s, often did town records as well as vital records. And again, the Mass Town Record Series fiche are online from Ancestry. Now, these clues are great. For one thing, you may find when your ancestor first moved into town. You're going to find that date because they first appear in a tax roll, or maybe they've been assigned a fence viewer or the Hogreaves of the community. You may also find that your ancestor had a town office. In this town office, like a Hogreaves or tax collector, may qualify you for patriotic service if you're joining the DAR or the SAR for the Revolutionary War. And it's great, valuable resources for female ancestors as well, because if something is brought before the selectmen of the town, it may be over a quarrel, and it could be your female ancestor that's being hauled in to talk to the selectmen and not your male ancestor. Now, where are they located? Again, they are not indexed and often in print, so you still have to go to the local town halls, city clerk's office, or historical societies. In my hometown of Stoughton, our town clerk about 20 years ago said, here, do you want these old 1700s records? We don't think they're valuable anymore for us to have. Would you like them? We took them with open arms, and I've been transcribing them part of my town's tercentenary project for 2026. So look for these records. Some of them have been imaged on microfilm from the Family History Library, and you may find that they're already digitized. Now, what do you find in these records? I mean, of course, the town meeting is one of the oldest parts of government in Massachusetts. The town meeting would be held often in the old parish church, and they would have selectmen's records in these records as well. Tax rolls, so your ancestor paying tax. Another way of knowing that they first showed up in the community. Proprietor records, when they're getting the land itself. We'll talk a little bit more about proprietor records shortly. Cattle marks. Now that's, the image on the right here shows these little drawings. Those are the slits in the crops in the holes that were put in the ears of your ancestors' cattle. When you think of the common, like Boston Common, that was once common grazing land for your ancestors' cattle, and most towns had common land. Or if your ancestors' cow or horse or animal or pig got out loose, this is their way of saying that that's my horse or my cow or my pig. The other thing that you get are warnings out. Your ancestor arrives in a community and was not legally supposed to be there. He's staying with relatives, or if somebody becomes sick and infirm, the town selectmen will often warn them back to the town they came from. And these warning out records are very valuable because they often give you the origin of where someone came from before they arrived in the town. Pauper records as well. If you're a pauper in the community and you have fallen upon hard times, the town is going to care for you. So you might find accounts from people for clothing and wood and supplies. If you come into the town and you're a pauper, you may be chargeable back to the community you come from. So you find that clue as to where you came from. A great book, again, it's out of print, is Anne Lanehart's Digging for Genealogical Treasure in New England Town Records. And this is a book you can find at NEHGS, also the Family History Library. And again, maybe this will be a book that will be updated sometime in the near future, because it will be needed to be updated because it's been nearly 25 years since it came out. Now, church records. Vital records in Massachusetts are really good, but to complement it, you really need to look at church records. We could spend an entire hour on this, but I'm going to concentrate on some of the key resources. On archive.org, and I've given you the hyperlink, this guide by Harold Worthley is the inventory of the congregational churches in Massachusetts from 1620 to 1805. What this book will give you, and you can look at this for free on Internet Archive, this is his dissertation from 50 years ago. Now, for instance, if you look at Boston in this book, it will give you the different ministers, the deacons of the church itself, and it will also give you where the church records are. If they have been printed, or if the records don't exist at all, he will allude to that as well. It's a really great source. I talked about Carol D. Wright's book about church records and town records and vital records as of 1884. Harold Worthley brought this book forward to 1970 for church records. So the old First Parish churches, the Congregational and Unitarian split occurred in the early 19th century. You're going to get all of these churches, every town in Massachusetts, including Boston, through the early part of the 19th century and back to the 1620s. Another place that Dr. Worthley had spent most of his entire career is the Congregational Library. And in recent years, since Dr. Worthley's death, they have been digitally scanning old church records, ones in their possession, as well as going around the Commonwealth and New England to copy old records. So the digital collections fold, there is a collection here on Old South Church in Boston. Let me show you how wonderful these images are. You're getting color images of the entire page, and you can move around with a scroll bar and actually see the records with all the blemishes, as well as all the T's being crossed and the I's being dotted. You can go into admissions of the church, baptisms, church records itself, marriages, membership lists, and these go back for Boston's Old South Church back to 1669. Do take a look at the Congregational Library. It's not just Massachusetts. There are other New England communities, and it's a valuable resource. Now, Family Search Catalog is also another place that you can search. So if I just put in Boston, Massachusetts, and search the catalog, I can find out what churches they have for Boston. I did a search here and I wanted to pick on one particular one, and I go into the records and I say, well, what ancestor do I want to find? So there are so many different churches my family attended. The nice thing is so many of them are digitized. One of the ones that I wanted to look at was the Pitt Street Church, or the Pitt Street Chapel, where my family attended in the 1830s and 1840s. When I actually went into it, I found that the range of the records are 1835 to 45, so it fit perfectly for me. I also found out that they were searchable. They has the magnifying glass, and that there's a camera with no key above it, which means I could search it from home. So let's take a peek into the records itself. As you may familiarize yourself with Family Searcher, you look at this film strip. Now, the best thing to do is, of course, zoom in, and it's a matter of getting one page, figuring if you're at the right spot, and just kind of plugging along, maybe 50 to 100 pages at one point in time, or maybe 25 to 10, till you narrow down to the time frame or the index, if you're lucky, in the book, to figure out what page you need. So we're going to move forward with this, and we'll just go down to one of the pages that matches in the Pitt Street Chapel. And I could find in the records here that I am going to locate all of the different marriages that occur to my family in the records. And they're right here in beautiful cursive handwriting. And my own ancestor's marriage was something that I had not seen the church record before, only the town record. And I was able to get it right from these records here. The other thing that I was able to find is that they also had when people joined the church. So they had the membership list. So I was able to find out who joined the church and who their baptisms of some of the individuals, because they joined by baptism or they joined as a member. Church records are both a wonderful resource, and they also have other things. If your ancestor is admonished or kicked out of the church, if they are asked for a letter of permission to go someplace else, church records will often tell you where your ancestor's family is going to. Maybe they need a letter of permission to go to another church. Carol Wright's book, as I mentioned, is a great source for records up to 1884. Harold Worthley's inventory in 1970. NEHGS with 28 million manuscripts. We have plenty of typescripts of church records, as well does the DAR library in Washington, D.C. And as you saw with FamilySearch.org, there are so many different denominations. Again, if we were doing just a talk on Massachusetts church records, I could cover all the different ones: Quaker, Baptist, Methodist, Jewish, whatever the case might be. We will have a chance to probably discuss this in future classes. So let's move on, and I'm going to talk about one specific one that we've added to our own collection, American Ancestors, and that is the Catholic records. And these are part of the collections of the Boston Archdiocese Archives, which we have worked with volunteers to both restore the books with them, digitize, and index. So let's take a little bit of a quick tour of this, if you will. So I'm going to do a search on someone, Rose Fitzgerald, born 1890, looking for her baptism. And I'm going to select the church. You can pick a pull-down, drop-down menu of all the churches, and I'm going to check St. Stephen's in Boston. I don't need to pick St. Stephen's, but I'm just going to do this to show you a specific church. And I'm going to hit Browse. Now, what I find here is that there is a baptism in 1890, giving the father is John Fitzgerald, and the mother is Josephine Hander. And I'm going to click on Rose's name, and I'm going to find her original record. Now, here is just a capsulized version. If I hit view, I can pull the whole thing up. And now I can see if you actually know who Rose Fitzgerald is. I think you probably know her son. If you look in the far corner here, Rose Fitzgerald married Joseph P. Kennedy. Yes, this is the mother of John F. Kennedy. Rose Fitzgerald Kennedy, who lived to be over 100 years old. This is her original 1890 baptism record on AmericanAncestors.org, with the through the cooperation and with the Boston Archdiocese Archives and the Roman Catholic Church Archdiocese of Boston. We're really thrilled to have these records because these are such a fragile and important part of Massachusetts history. Currently on American Ancestors, we have other church records as well as the Catholic church records. These are being added for town after town. But we talk about records that we have, like Boston church records. These are just some of the towns specifically on American Ancestors, not Catholic records per se, but Baptist and Methodist and sometimes even Quaker records you'll find on American Ancestors that we have. And maybe you'll see a town on here that is interest to you. Probate records. Let's talk a little bit about last will and testaments and records like that you'll find. Now, in any HGS on the 4th floor microtext department, you will find some of the bound indexes. These are where the go-to that we used for years, but so many of these are now being digitized, we never even have to blow the dust off the shelves to get these books because they're quickly easily to be found online. Why? Because on American Ancestors, we have the following. Every one of these are collections of the probate file papers, not the record books, but the actual papers for all of these counties. I'm sure you'll probably find one that interests you. Note on Boston and Suffolk County here, there's an asterisk. These records are going to go much later. Currently, we have 1630 to 1841. They're going to go much later into the 19th century, but they're still being scanned. There's just so many of them for Suffolk County. Now, how you search that, I'm going to do a search on somebody you may know of, and probably one or two of his descendants are in the room today. John Winthrop, and I'm searching 1630 to 1700, and I'm searching Suffolk County for his last will and testament. I hit search down here, and here I find his last will and testament in 1649. It is 5 pages long, and it gives me the case right down here. So I'm going to hit his image with the camera and I'll be able to see the original document. And just for the case of time, we're just going to see this first one, but this is an actual inventory page. Again, you can download it, you can print, you can zoom in and out of the actual record. So if you have any trouble, I'd say the best option is to download it and you can have it right on your own computer. The paleography of some of the 17th century records can be a little bit foreboding, and if you go to the National Archives of England, they have a free paleography class that you can search online. If you just search paleography, the National Archives, it will help you with some of this early clerical script of the 17th century. Now, if I did a search in the collection, and I'm not necessarily choosing one particular ancestor tonight, so I will pick his grandfather instead. Jonathan Poor, 1800 to 1810, search for a probate record. And I knew at that point in time the family is in Essex County, so I do that and hit search. I find that Captain Jonathan Poor, my Rev War ancestor, his case number 22360. There are 12 pages on it. And again, hit the camera icon here. And these are just capsulized images from it, just to kind of give you an idea of the quality of it. This is the docket itself. The file papers would be within it. Here's his last will and testament pages. These would be show up as one image at a time. Again, you can zoom in as I did with these. I cut and pasted them to put them together to show you. And I can go on to the next page. And the one thing that's great about genealogy is that we don't have a lot of ways of knowing what our ancestor looked like. So one of the things I love from probate records is the original signature and seal that your ancestor may have had. And also you want to look at the fan approach. Who are these witnesses? Besides who's in the last will and testaments. 20 years ago, if I wanted to look at this original record, I had to write to the state archives and get a copy of it from the Supreme Judicial Court archivist, pay for the copies. As an American Ancestors member, you can look at original Massachusetts probates, and we're adding so much more, and you don't have to write. You can just do it from home. And at this time with COVID, you can do a lot more genealogy from home. In this case, you wouldn't even have to have left your home regardless. They're right online for you to search. Now, the proprietor records itself are another great source, and these are how the towns were originally laid out land in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. Now, in the 17th and 18th century, the general court assigned grants of land to a certain group of settlers. So you may have a part of a town that had not been incorporated yet, or a part even further west, heading towards the Connecticut River Valley, that these are land grants that were pretty much given out. The general court would get these lands, they were settled as proprietorship committees, and then they distributed the land to be settled. There would be common land, and in some cases you would buy plots within it. The proprietorship acted as its own meeting, if you will, to settle land disputes, and if you wanted to sell your proprietorship land, you went through them, then it was recorded in the proprietorship records, not in the land deeds. Until a proprietorship folded, most of the land records are being recorded with them. Now, the problem is finding proprietorship records. It's not as easy as finding deeds in many cases. One way that you can do it, I'm going to go to the next slide, you can look in town halls. Town clerks, tax offices, or assessor offices occasionally have these records. One of the things that I have been trying to do is, as I find proprietorship records, I'm making an Excel spreadsheet of where the records are. County registries of deeds also have these records. Sometimes they're in libraries and local historical societies. Family Search has microfilmed and has a lot of them online, but not every single one. Published transcriptions of proprietorship records are very rare. I've only can think of maybe about a half a dozen of towns that have the proprietorships records from Massachusetts even typed up. So they're sometimes still in the original form. Now, I stumbled across the ones from my community. And we'll take to the next slide. And here's the Township of Dorchester. These are the early proprietorship papers. Township of Dorchester then split. The southern precinct became Stoughton. So these are the earliest records of my community. And they took and photo duplicated the original book. Nobody seems to know where the original papers are, so I'm hoping that they're someplace safely stored, but still haven't landed those. But I was delighted to get and copy this entire volume. And these proprietor records give me the earliest lot owners with the amount of acres that they have. In some cases, it's going to give you right down to the lot number as well. The other thing, the proprietorship records, again, Family Search. If you just do a keyword search on proprietor in the catalog, and then you could add something in Massachusetts or another state, you can find them. I did a search on proprietor, and when I went through the list, I found one for Cambridge, Massachusetts. Once I clicked on that, it gave me the note of all of the things that are available for Cambridge. I wanted to go down and know a little bit more about it, so I went into the land and property records. Now, normally a town won't have land and property records. In this case, they did, because there are the proprietorship records. And in this case, there was some from 1635 to 1841, and a bound transcribed copy from 1635 to 1829. So I'm going to click on this collection there, and that will actually bring me to the notes and to the book. Many of these books were published in the 19th and early 20th centuries, so you can use archive.org or HathiTrust to find the original. So here's an example of Richard Goodman and John Coward Rowe about 3 roods of land. John Steele, northwest by the Coward Lane, southwest by Edward Stebbings, southeast on the Common Pales, northeast. The verbiage is exactly as it was written in 1635. Why are these proprietorship records really valuable? Because if your ancestors lived in Massachusetts in the 17th century, this may be the first time that they are recorded in the town. These proprietorship records could be the earliest record. Land deeds itself, we're very lucky. At NEHGS, we have microfilm for probates, we have microfilm for land, but again, with NEHGS being closed and registries not probably accessible to you, you can look at a lot of these on Family Search. They're arranged by county. In fact, some of them have multiple registries for the same county. For instance, Berkshire County, Bristol County, Essex, and Middlesex and Worcester all have multiple deed registries. Now, we have microfilm just about to the 1800s, or sometimes later, going back to the 1600s, for these towns these counties in Massachusetts. For married male grantors, you also find the wife signing as well. So this may be the only time you find the signature or the mark of the husband and the wife together. And it may also name her for the only time. These have been very useful for early 17th and 18th century researchers to catch the name of the bride because she's giving up her dower right to the property. They often list occupations. So if you want to know the occupation of the grantor, the grantee buying and selling the land, that will be there as well. The only fire of any consequence that affected county courts in Massachusetts were in Barnstable County. The deed office burnt in 1827. The problem is that they only reconstituted and reconstructed the old deeds from the ones that were still kind of current. So if people owned land, they brought their own personal copy of the deed in to be re-recorded. Why? Because they wanted to have legal title to their property. A lot of the earlier deeds are lost. Now, and the other thing, again, the New England Handbook, why it becomes so valuable, are the changing county boundaries. My hometown is now in Norfolk County, but prior to 1793, we were in Suffolk County. So I'd be looking at Suffolk County deeds for my town for the first 70 years and for the last 200 in the present county of Norfolk. So it's a good little tip to know. Do research out your county history for your town. Now, the deeds itself, you can find them online. Here's an example of Suffolk County deeds. If I just click on the link right there, unfortunately, they're not indexed to the point that you can't go into them, but you can look at the index online. I know that's a little confusing. There's no index to search on the name, but if you click on the grantor, the grantee index, you can then find the correct volume and page for the deed that you need. There are over 1,128 films just for Suffolk County alone. But the nice thing is they're digital films. So here you have the actual deed. You've got the volume and page from the grantor and grantee index, and you can get all the details of the deed for you to search online. And of course, with Family Search, you can print it, you can download it, you can use tools, you can invert your image if it's a little hard to read or change the contrast and the brightness. Here's an example of the whole deed blown up. And the nice thing about it is when you're doing these deeds on Family Search, these records are going to be a valuable asset to you because you want to look at deeds. So many genealogists don't. They just know that their ancestor owned land or assume maybe they didn't have land. It will be a quick time of researching that county to see if your ancestors own property. So I highly suggest looking on Family Search and looking at the land deeds from Massachusetts that are available.
Well, thanks again, David. Let's take another quick break, answer your questions. So Catherine asks, what is the difference between proprietor's records and deeds?
Proprietor records preceded a community's recording of the deeds. So often what would happen, Catherine, is that a community like Cambridge in the early 1600s, the land would be parceled out. There would be a proprietorship committee that would have common land that would be set up, and then you would be parceling out town lots, and sometimes you're receiving land that's a little farther away, field lots, if you will, that your town lot would be where you had your house on the main street or near the church. And you may have had a larger acreage or proprietorship lot that was on the outskirts of the community, maybe where you had your fields, but not specifically your home. This was the earliest ways that some communities in Massachusetts started. My own hometown of Stoughton, when it became the South Precinct of Dorchester, they had a very large landmass, and you find these proprietorship lots, and that what would happen is if you went to sell the property later on or divide it, then you had to get a deed and to divide up and have the land surveyed. These original proprietorship lots were not always the perfect geometrical shape, but were often pretty squared, same amount of acreage, unless you bought multiple lots.
And you expressed a situation where the county boundaries changed, but of course state boundaries also changed. So
That's
Douglas,
true.
for example, Douglas is asking, does Bristol County still have Aquidneck Island's records up until it became part of Rhode Island?
If it's the original part of the state, they would still have the original records. So for instance, anything after it became part of Rhode Island, those would be under the Registry of Deeds for that part of Rhode Island it's now settled in. But before that, those original records are there. Case in point, my hometown of Stoughton, we have deeds that go back to 1726 in Suffolk County. They didn't tear the pages out or re-record everything in Norfolk County, so they will be with the original registry of deeds. And that's true also with Maine. Maine was part of Massachusetts, but Cumberland County deeds, even though they were recorded initially in Massachusetts, are still in Maine.
All right. And Debbie asks, what about Catholic Church records for New Bedford? It is a separate diocese. So how would you find those records?
Those are a little different. So the New Bedford and the Springfield diocese, which are outside of the Boston Roman Catholic Archdiocese, they don't have an archives that had such a complete collection. The Boston Archdiocese archives had a lot of the closed churches and the defunct churches, and New Bedford still retains those records. I know that NEHGS is hoping to work in the future with the other two archdioceses to try to get the records, but if the church is still open, in a lot of cases, Debbie, they still have their records. So your first place you want to do is contact that church, if not the New Bedford archives for the archdiocese. And if you have trouble beyond that, give me an email. I'll see if I can help you track them down.
All right. So I think those were all the questions. And I am responding to some questions, especially if those are more specific, suggesting that you either reach out to David by email or just sending you a quick answer to or pointing you to other resources in the chat. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to David, and we have a few other record groups to discuss.
Well, one of the things that I love very much are city directories. I think that's probably one of the first groups of records I looked at when I went to the Boston City Library, Public Library years ago. NEH has a very large collection on microfiche to the 1960s. Now, I'm sure you've used city directories remotely from home, from say Ancestry.com, for instance, has quite a few by browsing into the records. I find browsing, or you can search on a name, personally, online, sometimes the OCR doesn't catch it so well. So most city directories are in alphabetical order, so it doesn't take a lot of effort to browse through them. Large collections from Massachusetts Directory, besides the Boston Public Library, is the Massachusetts State Library has a very thorough, complete collection. The local libraries also have good sets for small towns. My own hometown had sporadic directories in the 1890s and 1900s, the 19-teens. But one thing you'll find also for small towns are poll tax listings or resident listings, which are a quasi-city directory, if you will, that kind of dealt with the paying of the poll tax of the individuals in the town. The first city directory actually in the entire country was published in Boston in 1789, and we have a copy of that at NEHGS. The city directory here, this is for Lawrence, Massachusetts in 1910. Things you'll find, of course, the house address the person lived at. You may find the death date of somebody who had died in the course of the year. Here's a Charles Knopfer who died December 21st, 1909. Charles Jr. removed to Boston from Lawrence by 1910. You've got people boarding at different addresses. So we have a Alexander Corner who boards at 284 High Street in Lawrence, but his house, he is a clerk at 85 Newbury Street in Lawrence. You're getting the person's occupation. If somebody's actively in the military, even in the Civil War, they'll say USN or USA for the Army or the Navy. You find that the people are listed in the military in World War I, Spanish-American War, and including World War II and beyond if the directories exist. The other thing you sometimes get are ads. So if a person actually had a business, they may have taken out a half page, quarter page, or a full page ad, or maybe it's on the cover of the directory that may give a picture of their piano company, their cabinet making or paper hanging company. So do take a peek at that, especially if they are in business. These directories are invaluable. One of the places you can find a lot of directories, perhaps if you don't have an Ancestry.com subscription or you can't make it into NEHGS anytime in the near future, is to look at Boston City directories as a search on Internet Archive, on archive.org. As you can see that they have a variety of different directories. Here's a 1796, one from 1916. Here's another one from 19 16 volume 1 and 2, and there are over 8,769 results for the different type of directories that I'm finding here, as well as the ones specifically for Boston. Census and tax list. Now, of course, I'm not going to talk about federal censuses because obviously you know how to find those. Those are on Ancestry.com. And let me talk a little bit about some of the major tax lists and state censuses that exist. Now, Betty Pruitt did a book called the Massachusetts Tax Valuation List in 1771. It was published in 1978. It's a very large, oversized book. Picton Press republished it 20 years later. It's incomplete because not every town is in it, but it does include towns in Maine because, of course, Maine's not going to become a separate state to nearly 50 years later. It's very valuable in the sense that you're getting people almost 20 years before the first federal census. And it is at the Mass State Archives. They're on very large, oversized sheets. So it's very hard to read it on microphone. So these books are very valuable. It's one of my sought after titles for my own personal library. Then there's the 1798 direct tax of Massachusetts and Maine. Let me tell you a little quick story about that. NEHGS, we're celebrating our 175th anniversary this year, founded in 1845. Early on in our existence, we got word that someone at the Boston Customs House was taking the old federal direct tax from Massachusetts and burning it in the furnace. Yeah, I'm sure you all just cringed. We got word of it. We got somebody over there and we saved, I would say, probably about 85 to 90% of it before it burned. They had not used the rest of these volumes. These are an interesting census. They're on American ancestors, and I'm going to show you some examples. I even tell you in some of the returns how many panes of glass you had in your windows in your home because you were taxed based on that. Now, there are also another collection that you may not know about. Those are the taking records, and I put in my syllabus how to find those. I had a sabbatical after I'd been at NEHS for 20 years, and I went and I transcribed the 1800 taking records for the city of Boston. They're almost like tax records, but they go a little step further, and I'll show you an example of that as well. 1800 for Boston, there is no federal census. It doesn't exist. Nobody's ever found the original year 1800 for Boston, so this is a census substitute. There's also 2 state censuses that survive, and these name everybody in the household. That's for 1855 and 1861, and because I love census and tax lists so much, part of my time at home during COVID is I transcribed out the over 1,000+ names on the 1861 Earl Report, and I'll show you that. You probably never heard of the Earl Report before, so we'll talk about that too. All right, so let's go on to 1798 direct tax. I'm not going to search on my direct ancestor, but I'll search on his brother, Stephen Poor, and I know that the family's living in Newbury. Now, I don't need to put in Newbury. I could just search on Stephen Poor, or for that matter, look at everybody named Stephen. I hit search. And there is in color the 1798 direct tax with all the information on Stephen Poor and giving me all the different quantities of land that he has, the acreage, and what he's paying for taxes, etc. Again, these are almost all lost in a fire, over 150 years ago. So the taking records, these records are at the Boston City Archives, Boston Public Library Rare Books Department and the Boston City Hall Archives. After 1822 at the City Archives, before 1822, when they were the town of Boston, they're at the Boston City Public Library's Rare Book Department. And that's when I look at the original volumes of this. I did a search here on Paul Revere to kind of give you an example of what the records say. Now, these are tax records with a twist. Here's an example in his Colonel Paul Revere. He has 1 poll of tax. His real estate is worth $2,500. He's a goldsmith, and he has a shop and furnaces. He has a large house, etc. Here's a neighbor who has 1/2 of a house and lives in Watertown. And then you have another person. This person is a sailor who doesn't own anything. He is just living in 1 room and he's poor. In the city directory of Boston, I found people in the taking records that are not mentioned in the city directories. And this also includes African-American families, as well as these sailors or people that may have just been in Boston for a short amount of time. It even gives you interesting descriptions of people. There was one that he described his wife as being completely insane. So you want to find out about your family's health. If it was apparent to the person writing this tax record, you may get more than you bargained for. But this is available on American Ancestors. Here's an example, and you can find this on Family Search. This is the 1855 state census for Massachusetts, and you can find the person, you get their age, you get where they were born, even if it's in a foreign country, you get their occupation, and these are all indexed. And again, this is 1855. The 1865 is quite similar. Go to the next image, and that will cover the end of the Civil War. So sometimes you're going to even get people that were involved in the war and they're still actively a soldier. Sometimes you can catch them on the list. These people are laborers and farmers. These are people living out in Woburn, Massachusetts in 1865. And of course, you get people born in Ireland. Sometimes the enumerator goes one step further and tells you the town that they were born in or the county in Ireland. So you may luck out. Now, I did tell you about the 1861 Earl Report. As you've heard, I'm a tribal historian. I'm not Native myself, but I've had a great interest in the Native American population of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. John Milton Earl started in 1859 to record the Native population of the Commonwealth. And this is an invaluable published book that came out, but it's not very easily to be found. So I got a copy from the state archives, and when I was home during COVID, I indexed the entire thing and I've imaged it for you. So if you put in the last name Crowd, which is one of the Massachusetts Ponkapog families, and hit search, I'm not putting in any particular town, I get a copy of the original page. So every name on here is indexed. So if I typed in Sally Burr, I'd go to this page. If I Daniel Crowd is here. It gives you the person's age, their marital status, if they're African American or what their Native American tribe is, what their occupation is, where they are currently living. As you can see, this is a grouping together of the Ponkapog Indians, but some are in Dedham, some are in Cambridge, some are in Canton. Tells you the valuable assets they own. In this case, Daniel Crowd owns one horse worth $40 and has 30 cows. He has 45 acres of land with buildings worth $1,500. So this is a great way of finding if your ancestor was a Native American in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, and tribes such as the Massachusetts Ponkapog and others will use this as a benchmark. If you find your ancestor living in Massachusetts or on this Earl Report of 1861, can help you qualify to get on the tribal rolls. Cemetery records. I have a love for cemeteries too. I suppose genealogists, you can't pass by one without wondering if you have a relative buried in there. In Massachusetts, I have so many cousins in the cemeteries, I had to write a book about them. This is my third edition of the Guide to Massachusetts Cemeteries. It's also available as an ebook. The ebook difference is that you can actually click on the cemetery name and it will take you directly to the page for that cemetery on Find a Grave. Each entry in the book will have the name of the town, when the town was settled, what town it daughtered from. So if you wondered about a town's earlier connection, so Woburn, Massachusetts daughtered in 1799 to form Burlington. So early Woburn people that were once buried in Woburn may now be buried in Burlington. As you can see here, an example of that, Burlington doesn't start till 1799, but there is an old burying ground. The precinct burying ground started in 1736. You get the address where it's located, sometimes right down to a street address. You find out if the vital records are included. I had talked in the pre-1850 Mass Vital Records about CR records for church records or GR records for gravestone records. If they're in the published volume, you're going to get that citation. And also if it's a manuscript at any HGS or is at the DAR, another great place for a repository for cemetery gravestone transcriptions, you'll find that as well. And you'll also get the contact information on the town hall. Massachusetts cemeteries are outdoor museums and are a genealogical gold mine. The sad thing is that the 19th century gravestones that have been ignored for so long are really starting to deteriorate. And these early transcriptions, like the ones we have in NEHGS, if they were done, catch the inscriptions while they were still legible. I hope that you have a chance to use my guide if you're out and about in cemeteries this year or soon to be in Massachusetts. Now, on American Ancestors' website, we have a variety of different cemetery databases. One in particular one is just for the old cemeteries of Boston, and that was done by my colleague Bob Dunkel and Ann Lanehart, where they transcribed all the early gravestones that were in published form for Boston, and that goes back to 1649. Another database that we have available, and again, all these links are in the syllabus for you, and also on the slides right here if you need them. You can search on part of our agreement with the Boston Archdiocese Archives. We're starting to get their cemetery records. First one we started off with was St. Augustine Cemetery, and that cemetery started 201 years ago. The type of records that you can find are amazing. They're not just transcriptions done in computer format. When you do a search on that and you get a match, you can find records that look like this. You can find a typescript of the actual gravestones. You can find the original burial and lot sales. So these will come up as different options for you if you search on a person. And you also can find in this collection the actual photograph of the gravestone and the inventory sheets that were done in the latter part of the 20th century on the condition of the gravestones within the cemetery. This is a tremendous database, and we're so pleased to have it on American Ancestors. Of course, there are two other websites to take into account for Massachusetts cemeteries, and that's Find a Grave and Billion Graves. If you're a submitter, I thank you. I have put in over 10,000 gravestones for my own hometown because personally, in the middle of winter, the last thing I want to do is go out and find a gravestone for somebody. And it makes my research as a local historian so much easier. Newspapers. Can't stop talking about resources that are available that are now becoming so much more easier to use. DNA has been wonderful, but newspapers to me is the second best thing. I still find things to bring my ancestors back to life in newspapers. Now, of course, the best collection for Massachusetts on newspapers is located a short walk from NEHGS at the Boston Public Library. Now, many of these newspapers that we had to crank through by hand are now searchable online. In fact, we have indexes for some of them at NEHGS, including the Boston Obituary Index from 1704 to 1795 and 1784 to 1840 for the Old Columbian Sentinel. That was a regional newspaper. Think of kind of USA Today for the East Coast. That caught people from every part of New England and abroad and got you interesting obituaries or death notes. Didn't get everybody, but it does get quite a few. The Boston Evening Transcript, we have those available, as well as the genealogy column in the Boston Evening Transcript, which is really the earliest way of putting out a query about what you wanted to search in your genealogy. Another great database is the Search for Missing Friends, and these are ads taken for ancestors that may have had a brother who came over from Ireland and your family comes over 20 years later. You put an ad, I'm looking for Thomas Kennedy. He arrived here in 1859. I can't find him. He was last known to live in Swampscott, Massachusetts. Boom. That is a way to get into the record and find an ad and may connect you back to Ireland. And these are all indexed and online on American Ancestors. Military records. Now, I gave you more of a complete breakdown from Massachusetts resources because, as you know, I've lectured on military records plenty of times, but this would be specifically for Massachusetts. So those hyperlinks in your syllabus are going to help you. But I'm just going to briefly talk about that because the syllabus gives you a little bit more detail. Military lists for the colonial wars to the Civil War in print, folks. You really don't have to go very far to find them. The list I've given you will cover the colonial wars right down to World War II. The earliest of the military records from Massachusetts are with the Massachusetts State Archives. And these are muster rolls, bay vouchers, Sometimes they're lists from the commanding officer writing glowing letters of recommendation for your ancestor, or sometimes your ancestor didn't do something so well, and it's they're being disciplined. So you never know what you're going to find until you dig into the records. The Mexican War through World War I, these records were actually just recently transferred to the Massachusetts State Archives. But for the Mexican War, I helped transcribe those for an FGS project. Of course, you know about the War of 1812 project. They recently did one for the Mexican War, and Massachusetts only sent one regiment to the Mexican War, and I supplied the images and the work for that. That hyperlink is available for you in the syllabus. World War II and later are with the Adjutant General's office. Most cities and towns in Massachusetts, if you're dealing with somebody from World War II or later, the veterans agent, if you contact them and the veteran in particular is deceased and is a relative, they can give you the DD-214 on your relative, the discharge. And for World War II veterans, of course, we know with the Army and the Air Force, the old Army Air Corps, the fire in St. Louis, these locally held Adjutant General's records are often all that exists from World War I, World War II, Korea, and Vietnam for the Army and the Air Force. So use the state as a resource when the federal can't help you. Military histories are often published as chapters in town histories, especially the earlier wars like the Revolution, King Philip's War, and even in some cases as late as the Civil War with pictures of the people who had died during the war or engravings done from old photographs, etc.
All right. Well, thank you, David. You covered a lot. I know that we're over time, but still time for questions. So if you have anything that you'd like to ask, go ahead and type it into the chat panel. I know a few people are asking about where to find the syllabus or the handout. That is available on the course webpage. You should have received an email from me. If you didn't, you'll receive an email from me once the recording of this class session is posted. So that will be later tonight. I can put it in the chat as well. But so let's see if folks have questions. Now Sue asks, you showed us that you can get the Earl report on AmericanAncestors.org. Thanks to your great work and great efforts. Where would you find the 1855 and 1865 state censuses?
Oh, that's real easy. The 1855 and 65 on the screenshot you'll see from my slides as well as in your syllabus will be the hyperlink. That's found on FamilySearch.org. So FamilySearch.org, if you go into a keyword search and you put in 1855 Massachusetts in their catalog or 1865 Massachusetts, you'll also go directly to it. And again, it's indexed. You'll also find them on American Ancestors. In case you're not an American Ancestors member, we encourage you to do so, but you can find them on our website as well as Family Search.
Thanks. And Alfred asks, is there a listing of the burial locations for Rev War veterans in Massachusetts?
I really wish I could give you an honest answer on that. There has not been a great effort. There's been a partial effort. There's a great book that was done in about almost 40 years ago by Pat Law Hatcher, and it's a gravestones of Revolutionary War patriots. I am the state historian for the Massachusetts Sons of the American Revolution, and we're making a concerted effort with our Patriot Research System to record gravestones. The DAR has done yeoman's work for the past century to record them. Is there a one-stop shopping? Not really. And the unfortunate thing is a lot of times the Revolutionary War veterans' graves aren't marked. Many times an ancestor may have fallen on hard times. They could have been buried in their backyard in a small cemetery, and we just allude to where they are. So we're not sure of 100% of them, unfortunately. But if you know of any, by all means, photograph them and put them on Find a Grave or Billion Graves.
And Carolyn asks, could you talk a little bit about the War of 1812 project that you mentioned, that we should all know about, but we may not know about it?
Okay. The War of 1812 was through the generosity of genealogists who gave $5 or $500 in conjunction with the Federation of Genealogical Societies, FGS. They sent out individuals to color scan the War of 1812 pensions. I'm sorry, the pension records that had not been really even utilized by genealogists because they were so fragile, and you'd have to go to the archives or pay $80 to get the first 100 pages. Now they're all online for free. Now, I should say not all, because it's to the latter part of the alphabet. It's not completely done yet. I think it is right now down to the letter S or T. I may be off on that. I'd have to go online to check. But that's on Fold 3. Now, you don't even have to be a member of fold3.com. You can look at that database for free. And again, that's for pensioners of the War of 1812.
And Kathleen asked, where can I find immigration and other records for a Scottish woman born about 1761 who got married in Massachusetts?
Unfortunately, because she probably didn't naturalize, naturalization starts in the 1790s in the United States. A woman, unless they're in business for themselves, didn't have the reason to actually become a naturalized citizen. The immigration records don't exist. The 18th century is probably a black hole for most of the country for passenger lists. For New England, for instance, Massachusetts, you find records in the 1600s. The 1630s is the multitude, and usually those are records of embarkation. And then it kind of goes dead in the water, if you will, till about 1820 when it becomes federally mandated that the Atlantic ports have to keep passenger lists. For the 18th century, there were a few surviving lists for Boston from the Customs House. There was a Customs House fire, so they may have existed at one point in time, but for the most part, 1700s, you won't find a passenger list, I'm afraid.
And Rebecca just asks, is there a way that one can volunteer to do some kind of coordinated cemetery grave documentation or photographs? And how do you know which cemeteries still need to be done or documented?
Well, I can tell you the easiest way is just to get an account with Find a Grave. It's free. And if you pick a cemetery in particular, there's often a percentage of gravestones that have been entered in, but some of them that don't have photographs. So it says like 70% done, 90% done, or 20% done. And then basically you just get out there with your camera. It's a great activity to do in times where we have to socially distance, and just photograph the cemetery. You may even find a small cemetery that's never been done. And so it's just really volunteering. And also, if you have put a request for a photograph, say if I can't visit a cemetery in Western Mass, I can make a request on Find a Grave to have a photograph taken, and volunteers will get notified that live in the area that will go out and photograph it. So you can become a volunteer like that as well, as I am for my local area.
All right. Well, thank you again, David, for your great presentation and for staying late with all of us and spending your evening with the participants of this course. If we didn't get to your question, or if something comes up as you start to review maybe the recording or the handout, or you start to kind of look through these record groups and apply what you've learned to your own family history research, if questions come up, you can always reach David directly, and you see his email address on this screen, dalambert@nehgs.org. That's also on the handout for this class, and it's on the course webpage as well. So multiple locations, so feel free to reach out to him. And of course, David also does one-on-one consultations. So if you want more hands-on help with your research, you can certainly book a consultation with David or one of our other experts. So I want to just again point you to that course webpage. So you see kind of the long and convoluted URL on your screen. You should get an email from me again later this evening once the recording is available, and the handout should appear on the left-hand side. So I know a few people mentioned that for them it appears at the bottom of their screen. It might just depend on kind of the size of the screen that or how you're viewing it, but that should be there. And if you don't see it, or you want me to send it to you as an attachment, I can do that as well. And again, you'll have access to all of these materials, the recordings, everything until the end of November, and I'm always happy to grant an extension if you need more time. So thank you again for joining us for our first class of our 6-session seminar. Be sure to join us next week at the same time when genealogist Melanie McComb will discuss Maine research. And if you'd like to access more how-to resources or learn about upcoming online educational programs, please visit our online learning center, americanancestors.org/education. Stay safe, stay healthy, and I look forward to seeing you online next week. Goodbye for now.